They always say the truth breaks a family, but I learned it can also save the one person everyone tried to erase. I never expected that lesson to begin with a slap. I still remember the way the sound echoed through the dining room that winter night, sharp enough to cut through the quiet like a dropped glass. My cheek burned instantly, but it was the silence afterward that hurt more than the sting. Every eye at the table widened, every fork froze midair, and I stood there, feeling the room tilt beneath me as if the floor itself had decided to step away. I had been preparing for that moment without even realizing it. Years of looking over my shoulder, years of being treated like the uninvited extra in my own home, years of feeling the chill settle into the walls whenever Mark walked past me without a word. I should have seen the slap coming. I should have sensed the shift before it happened. But nothing prepares you for the day your own parent decides you are disposable. It started earlier that evening when I came home from a closing shift at Morning Brew Tacoma. My hands were still cold from carrying bags of trash to the dumpster. The house was glowing with lights. Cars lining the driveway, voices drifting from the dining room. I had forgotten about the dinner Lydia had planned for Mark's colleagues. Or maybe I had not forgotten. Maybe I had blocked it out. I slipped off my shoes quietly and moved toward the staircase, hoping to disappear before anyone noticed me. But Lydia's voice snapped through the air like she had been waiting in the shadows. "Ava, come here." I stopped mid-step. Her heels clicked against the hardwood as she approached, her eyes scanning me from head to toe like she was inspecting a stain she could not scrub out. "You need to show some respect tonight," she said, smoothing her hair with the kind of elegance she reserved for crowds. No attitude, no scenes. "Do you understand me?" I nodded even though my stomach tightened. There was always something she needed to control, something she needed to sculpt into her version of perfection. And somehow, I was always in the way. She stepped back and gestured toward the dining room. "Mark wants you at the table." I almost laughed. Mark had not wanted me anywhere near his table in years. But I walked in anyway, keeping my head level, breathing slow. The room was filled with people in crisp suits and polished smiles. A dozen eyes glanced at me as I entered, and I felt myself shrink a little. Mark sat at the head of the table, shoulders squared, hands folded neatly. His gaze lifted to me for half a second before he pretended he had never seen me walk in. That was typical. I had become the kind of presence he tolerated but never acknowledged. "Sit," he said. Just one word, sharp, final. I pulled out a chair at the far end, trying to make myself small. I barely touched the napkin before Lydia leaned forward and said loudly enough for the guests to hear, "It is nice of Ava to join us. She has been quite distracted lately." A couple of people chuckled politely. I kept my expression neutral, but inside something twisted. I had learned long ago that humiliation was one of Lydia's favorite tools. She wielded it with a soft voice and a sweet smile, making sure no one noticed the cruelty wrapped inside her words. Dinner continued with small talk and laughter, but underneath it all, I sensed something brewing. Mark spoke about the firm. Lydia complimented someone's dress. The baby monitor crackled on the counter, but every few minutes, Lydia's eyes flicked toward me with a quiet tension that made my skin prickle. Then Mark set his fork down and cleared his throat. His voice cut through the chatter like a cold blade. "We need to address something as a family." The room stilled, my pulse quickened. He looked directly at me, and in that moment I knew something irreversible was coming. "You have been making things difficult in this house," he said, "and it needs to stop." Lydia added softly, "She has been ungrateful, you know that." A ripple of discomfort passed through the guests. I felt heat rise in my chest. I opened my mouth to speak, but before a sound left me, Mark stood abruptly, walked toward me, and with no warning, struck me across the face. Gasps filled the room. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." A woman covered her mouth. A man pushed back his chair in shock. I staggered slightly but caught myself on the table's edge. I looked up at Mark. His face was flushed with anger. Lydia watched with a thin smile curling at the corner of her lips. "You will not embarrass us again," he said quietly. Something inside me clicked, not with fear, not with pain, with clarity. All the hushed phone calls at night, all the money disappearing, all the glances exchanged between Lydia and Mark's brother, all the secrets swirling like dust in corners, no one bothered to clean. Suddenly they were no longer scattered fragments. They were threads. And that slap was the knot that tied them together. I stood up slowly. The room held its breath. I pressed a hand against my cheek. My voice when it came out was steady in a way that surprised even me. "If you want to talk about embarrassment," I said, "maybe you should make sure you actually know who belongs in this family." Conversation stopped. Glasses froze in midair. Lydia's smile faltered. I did not say more. Not yet. Not that night. Not in front of them. But in that moment, I decided one thing with absolute certainty. If they wanted a war, I would give them the truth. And truth cuts deeper than any slap. I walked down the hallway without looking back. And even though my steps felt steady, something inside me trembled the way a window rattles when a storm is about to break. The noise of the dining room faded behind me, replaced by the muffled hum of the house, the same house that had held my entire childhood and yet had never felt more foreign than it did in that moment. I stopped near the bottom of the stairs, not to collect myself, but because a memory rose so sharply it felt like it had reached out and grabbed my shoulder. For a second, I could almost smell cinnamon and butter in the air. Evelyn's kitchen used to smell like that on Sunday afternoons. The scent had disappeared years ago, replaced by whatever expensive diffuser Lydia bought from some boutique in Seattle. But my mind pulled me back to a time when this house had been warm and lived in, not polished and hollow like it was now. I remember being 11, sitting at the kitchen counter while Evelyn rolled out a pie crust. She always let me help even when I made a mess. I would dust her sleeve with flour without meaning to, and she would just laugh and brush my hair out of my face. She told me I had hands made for shaping things. She said it like a promise. Back then, it was just the two of us most of the time, because Mark was always gone, always busy, always somewhere building a life that somehow did not include us, unless he needed to show off a perfect family. Evelyn filled the house with small things that made it feel alive. Plants by the windows that curled toward the sun, books stacked on the coffee table with corners folded down, notes written to herself on sticky pads by the fridge. When I look back, those tiny things are what protected me. They were like clues that love had existed here, even if it was being erased piece by piece later on. The memory shifted, carrying me to the night everything changed. Evelyn had grown pale by then. She moved slower and breathed heavier, but she still hummed while grading student papers at the kitchen table. One evening, rain pattered against the windows in that steady way Tacoma rain does. I was washing dishes and she called me over. There was something in her voice that pulled all the air out of my lungs. She rested her hand over mine, her fingers thin and cool. She did not smile at first. She looked at me like she was trying to memorize my face. That was the night she told me the truth I had never even suspected. I was not her biological daughter. She and Mark had adopted me as a baby. She spoke gently, but her voice wavered like she was afraid the truth would hurt me more than anything else. I remember staring at the countertop, at the pale blue tile with little cracks running through it, and feeling the floor sway. She squeezed my hand and said that biology meant nothing to her, that I was hers in every way that mattered. She told me she fought for me from the moment she saw me in the hospital nursery. She said I was the bravest little thing she had ever held. But then she lowered her voice and said something that chilled me even at 11. Mark thrives on control. I tried to soften him, but he will not know how to love gently without me here. Her words wrapped around me like a warning she had spent years trying to find the courage to say. Before she went to bed that night, she placed a sealed envelope in the back of her dresser drawer. She told me I should open it only when I was older, only when I needed it. I did not understand then. I just nodded because that was what daughters do when their mothers give them something weighty. A few weeks later, Evelyn passed away in her sleep. The house felt different immediately. Mark arrived home from work long after the sun set, barely speaking, barely acknowledging my existence as he swept through the hallway, the first night without her. I sat in the living room with her favorite scarf pressed to my face, breathing in the faint scent of vanilla she always wore. I cried quietly so Mark would not hear. He did not like noise. After the funeral, he boxed up her books. Lydia had not entered our lives yet, but even then Mark was clearing away anything that reminded him of Evelyn. I tried to stop him, but he only said that holding on to things made grief worse. He put the boxes in the garage and locked the door. I never saw those books again. For years, it was just me and a man who looked at me like an obligation. I learned to stay out of the way, to keep my room clean, to never ask for anything. I cooked my own meals, did my own laundry, and tried to stay invisible. Sometimes I wondered if he forgot I was adopted, or if he remembered every time he looked at me. I opened the envelope when I turned 16, partly because I wanted to feel close to Evelyn again, and partly because I sensed something shifting in the house, something tightening around me. Inside was a copy of a trust document Evelyn had prepared before she died. I did not understand all of it at the time, but the part I understood was that she had left money specifically for my future, locked away until I turned 18. She wrote a note on the last page saying she knew I would face things she could not protect me from, but she hoped that this gift would carry me through. The more I read, the more I understood what she had feared. If I was forced out of the house before turning 18, Mark would lose any chance of touching that trust. It was untouchable unless I willingly signed something, which I never would. Evelyn had built a wall of protection around me with those documents, a wall Mark had been trying to climb for years without my knowing. Everything changed when Lydia entered the picture 2 years later. She swept into this home like a fresh coat of paint covering up cracks. She was warm at first. Too warm, maybe, but that warmth never touched me. She complimented Mark endlessly, told him how strong he was for raising a daughter alone, and started hinting that the house needed a feminine touch. Those hints turned into actions. The plants Evelyn nurtured were tossed. The bookshelves were cleared. Even the xylophone Evelyn used with her students, the one I used to tap while she graded papers, disappeared. Lydia looked at me like I was a reminder of a life she did not want to compete with. I saw it in her eyes. She wanted a clean slate, and I was not part of it. When she got pregnant with Colton, everything clicked. Mark finally had what he wanted. A real family, a real heir, a child who fit the picture he wanted to present to everyone around him. I stood at the bottom of the stairs that night after the slap, letting these memories wash over me like waves. Every moment with Evelyn felt like a hand steadying me, guiding me through the storm I was standing in. I ran my fingers gently over my cheek, which still pulsed where Mark had struck me. In the dining room behind me, murmurs rose and fell, the soft clattering of silverware being set down, hushed conversations that had nothing to do with me but revolved around me all the same. I breathed in slowly. The air tasted like tension and old grief and something else, something new, something like resolve. I climbed a few steps and sat on the midway landing, where I used to sit as a kid, listening to Evelyn hum. I imagined her voice now, quiet but firm, telling me that storms do not break you if you learn to stand in them. And for the first time in a long time, I believed her. I rested my elbows on my knees on that landing, feeling the rise and fall of my breath start to settle. But the silence did not last. A door clicked somewhere behind me, followed by the faint echo of footsteps moving through the hallway, not toward me, but toward the front foyer where guests were beginning to gather their coats, whispering among themselves. The house felt like it had tilted, as if one violent moment at the table had loosened every seam holding it together. I stood and walked up a few more steps, far enough to be out of sight, but close enough to hear the sound of Lydia's voice from the dining room. She sounded shaky now, the kind of performance tremble she used when she needed sympathy. A guest murmured something comforting. Someone else whispered that these situations were always difficult with teenagers. I squeezed the railing until my fingers ached. They did not know me. They knew the version Lydia curated. They knew the house she controlled, not the life I had lived inside it. I turned toward the upper floor and climbed the rest of the stairs. My feet carried me almost automatically to the door that used to be Evelyn's room. The door had been painted over since she died, the pale lavender replaced by a cool, tasteful beige that Lydia claimed made the hallway feel modern. It only made it feel empty to me. I touched the doorknob and pushed it open. The room no longer smelled like Evelyn. It smelled like the citrus detergent Lydia used for everything. The bed was different. The curtains were different. The picture frames she once filled with photos of her students were gone, but the shape of the room could never change. Even stripped bare, I could still picture Evelyn sitting at the foot of the bed and tying my shoelaces because I had scraped my knee outside. I could hear the rustle of her dress, the warm patience in her voice. I crossed the room slowly. Lydia used it now as a storage space for all her staging items, fabric samples, color swatches, things she brought home from clients. I navigated through boxes as though they were obstacles in a place I had known by heart. stepping over a stack of throw pillows and moving a crate of paint samples to get to the far corner where a small wooden dresser still sat. It was the only piece Lydia had not replaced, because it was too heavy to move easily. She probably assumed it held nothing important. She had no idea that in the bottom drawer, pushed far in the back, I had hidden the scarf Evelyn used to wear and the trust documents she left for me. I opened the drawer and lifted the scarf first. It still carried the faintest trace of her. I pressed it to my face, breathing in what remained of a life that had been pushed out of this house. I sat on the floor and closed my eyes. This was the part of the house where I felt closest to her. Even now, I could almost hear her telling me to sit up straight, to take my time, to choose battles wisely. I let the fabric rest on my lap and leaned my head back against the wall. The sounds from downstairs grew softer with distance, muffled enough that I could breathe without the pressure of so many eyes. The memory of Lydia's arrival spread across my mind like a cold draft. The day she moved in, she greeted me with a bright smile and a hug I did not return. Her perfume was sharp and unfamiliar. She told me she wanted us to be close. But the next morning, she told me my room needed a deep cleaning because it looked like a child lived there. I was 14. I cleaned anyway. Lydia treated the house like a blank canvas. Within a month, she had replaced the living room sofa, repainted the walls, replaced all the bedding in every room. She never asked me what I wanted or what made me comfortable. When I questioned the disappearance of Evelyn's belongings, she smiled and said that holding on to the past was unhealthy. I knew better. She wanted the past gone because she could not compete with it. I remembered one afternoon when I came home from school and saw cardboard boxes lined up by the garage. Evelyn's old rocking chair, her stack of gardening books, even the little ceramic bird she kept on the windowsill. All of it was ready to be donated. I picked up the bird and held it like something alive. Lydia walked up behind me. She told me things only kept their power if you refused to let them go. Her smile was gentle, but the words felt like a command. I held the scarf tighter now. She had tried to erase Evelyn from every corner of the house. But this piece, this one small soft piece, she never found. The floor creaked behind me. I turned and saw Grace Miller standing in the doorway. She had probably followed the sounds of the door opening. Grace lived 2 houses down and had known Evelyn well. She looked at me with that soft, steady gaze older women have when they recognize pain without needing to be told anything. She stepped inside and closed the door gently. Her voice was nearly a whisper. "Ava, are you all right?" I nodded, even though I was not. She sat beside me on the floor without asking permission. She did not reach for me or touch my hand. She just sat there, letting me know I was not alone. I said quietly, "He hit me." Her breath left her chest in a slow, heavy exhale. I heard the shock, but not surprise. I think she had suspected something for a long time. She looked toward the doorway, making sure no one else had followed her, then leaned closer. "I have seen the way Lydia speaks to you. I have heard things through the fence. This house has not been right since Evelyn passed." I closed my eyes. I did not need anyone to confirm it. I had lived it. Grace continued softly. "You did not deserve what happened down there." A knot in my throat made it hard to answer. Silence settled between us gently, unlike the silence downstairs that was sharp and judgmental. The silence felt safe. After a while, she rested her hand on the dresser. "Evelyn would want you to take care of yourself. She fought hard for you." I swallowed hard. "I know." Grace studied my face for a moment, then glanced toward the hallway. "I should go before someone sees me in here. But Ava, if you ever need a place to sit and breathe, my door is open." When she left, the room felt dimmer but calmer. I stayed there for another minute, running my fingers along the scarf before folding it carefully and tucking it into my bag. I was old enough to know I could not leave anything important in this house anymore. Lydia and Mark were crossing lines they could not uncross, and I could feel something building, something inevitable. I stood and closed the drawer. Though there was little left inside it, I took one last look at the room. Even stripped down, I could still see Evelyn kneeling by the bed, helping me with my school project, or humming while she organized lesson plans. The sound of voices downstairs rose again, sharper this time. Someone must have asked Mark to explain himself. I heard his irritated tone traveling up the stairwell. Lydia's voice followed, defensive and brittle. It felt like the whole house was unraveling at the edges. I walked out of the room and down the hallway toward my own. My reflection in the window at the end of the hall surprised me. My cheek was still flushed from the slap, but something in my eyes looked different. It was not fear, not anymore. I reached my room and closed the door gently behind me, shutting out the noise, shutting out the chaos. I sat on the edge of my bed and let out a long, slow breath. The scarf lay beside me, soft and steady, a reminder that I was not as powerless as Mark always wanted me to feel. In the quiet of my room, with the house buzzing faintly around me, I felt a shift inside, the same shift I had sensed downstairs, but stronger now, sharper. I knew the night was not finished with me. I knew I would have to walk back into that dining room soon. But for the moment, I sat still, letting the truth of my past settle into place, like pieces of a puzzle I had been trying to assemble for years. I had no idea what Lydia and Mark were saying about me downstairs. I did not care. All I knew was that the next time I faced them, I would not be the girl who let them decide who I was. I rested my elbows on my knees on that landing, feeling the rise and fall of my breath start to settle, but the silence did not last. A door clicked somewhere behind me, followed by the faint echo of footsteps moving through the hallway, not toward me, but toward the front foyer where guests were beginning to gather their coats, whispering among themselves. The house felt like it had tilted, as if one violent moment at the table had loosened every seam holding it together. I stood and walked up a few more steps, far enough to be out of sight, but close enough to hear the sound of Lydia's voice from the dining room. She sounded shaky now, the kind of performance tremble she used when she needed sympathy. A guest murmured something comforting. Someone else whispered that these situations were always difficult with teenagers. I squeezed the railing until my fingers ached. They did not know me. They knew the version Lydia curated. They knew the house she controlled, not the life I had lived inside it. I turned toward the upper floor and climbed the rest of the stairs. My feet carried me almost automatically to the door that used to be Evelyn's room. The door had been painted over since she died, the pale lavender replaced by a cool, tasteful beige that Lydia claimed made the hallway feel modern. It only made it feel empty to me. I touched the doorknob and pushed it open. The room no longer smelled like Evelyn. It smelled like the citrus detergent Lydia used for everything. The bed was different. The curtains were different. The picture frames she once filled with photos of her students were gone, but the shape of the room could never change, even stripped bare. I could still picture Evelyn sitting at the foot of the bed and tying my shoelaces because I had scraped my knee outside. I could hear the rustle of her dress, the warm patience in her voice. I crossed the room slowly. Lydia used it now as a storage space for all her staging items, fabric samples, color swatches, things she brought home from clients. I navigated through boxes as though they were obstacles in a place I had known by heart, stepping over a stack of throw pillows and moving a crate of paint samples to get to the far corner where a small wooden dresser still sat. It was the only piece Lydia had not replaced, because it was too heavy to move easily. She probably assumed it held nothing important. She had no idea that in the bottom drawer, pushed far in the back, I had hidden the scarf Evelyn used to wear and the trust documents she left for me. I opened the drawer and lifted the scarf first. It still carried the faintest trace of her. I pressed it to my face, breathing in what remained of a life that had been pushed out of this house. I sat on the floor and closed my eyes. This was the part of the house where I felt closest to her. Even now, I could almost hear her telling me to sit up straight, to take my time, to choose battles wisely. I let the fabric rest on my lap and leaned my head back against the wall. The sounds from downstairs grew softer with distance, muffled enough that I could breathe without the pressure of so many eyes. The memory of Lydia's arrival spread across my mind like a cold draft. The day she moved in, she greeted me with a bright smile and a hug I did not return. Her perfume was sharp and unfamiliar. She told me she wanted us to be close. But the next morning, she told me my room needed a deep cleaning because it looked like a child lived there. I was 14. I cleaned anyway. Lydia treated the house like a blank canvas. Within a month, she had replaced the living room sofa, repainted the walls, replaced all the bedding in every room. She never asked me what I wanted or what made me comfortable. When I questioned the disappearance of Evelyn's belongings, she smiled and said that holding on to the past was unhealthy. I knew better. She wanted the past gone because she could not compete with it. I remembered one afternoon when I came home from school and saw cardboard boxes lined up by the garage. Evelyn's old rocking chair, her stack of gardening books, even the little ceramic bird she kept on the windowsill. All of it was ready to be donated. I picked up the bird and held it like something alive. Lydia walked up behind me. She told me things only kept their power if you refused to let them go. Her smile was gentle, but the words felt like a command. I held the scarf tighter now. She had tried to erase Evelyn from every corner of the house, but this piece, this one small soft piece, she never found. The floor creaked behind me. I turned and saw Grace Miller standing in the doorway. She had probably followed the sounds of the door opening. Grace lived 2 houses down and had known Evelyn well. She looked at me with that soft, steady gaze older women have when they recognize pain without needing to be told anything. She stepped inside and closed the door gently. Her voice was nearly a whisper. "Ava, are you all right?" I nodded, even though I was not. She sat beside me on the floor without asking permission. She did not reach for me or touch my hand. She just sat there, letting me know I was not alone. I said quietly, "He hit me." Her breath left her chest in a slow, heavy exhale. I heard the shock, but not surprise. I think she had suspected something for a long time. She looked toward the doorway, making sure no one else had followed her, then leaned closer. "I have seen the way Lydia speaks to you. I have heard things through the fence. This house has not been right since Evelyn passed." I closed my eyes. I did not need anyone to confirm it. I had lived it. Grace continued softly, "You did not deserve what happened down there." A knot in my throat made it hard to answer. Silence settled between us gently, unlike the silence downstairs that was sharp and judgmental. This silence felt safe. After a while, she rested her hand on the dresser. "Evelyn would want you to take care of yourself. She fought hard for you." I swallowed hard, I know. Grace studied my face for a moment, then glanced toward the hallway. "I should go before someone sees me in here, but Ava, if you ever need a place to sit and breathe, my door is open." When she left, the room felt dimmer but calmer. I stayed there for another minute, running my fingers along the scarf before folding it carefully and tucking it into my bag. I was old enough to know I could not leave anything important in this house anymore. Lydia and Mark were crossing lines they could not uncross, and I could feel something building, something inevitable. I stood and closed the drawer, though there was little left inside it. I took one last look at the room, even stripped down. I could still see Evelyn kneeling by the bed, helping me with my school project, or humming while she organized lesson plans. The sound of voices downstairs rose again, sharper this time. Someone must have asked Mark to explain himself. I heard his irritated tone traveling up the stairwell. Lydia's voice followed, defensive and brittle. It felt like the whole house was unraveling at the edges. I walked out of the room and down the hallway toward my own. My reflection in the window at the end of the hall surprised me. My cheek was still flushed from the slap, but something in my eyes looked different. It was not fear, not anymore. I reached my room and closed the door gently behind me, shutting out the noise, shutting out the chaos. I sat on the edge of my bed and let out a long, slow breath. The scarf lay beside me, soft and steady, a reminder that I was not as powerless as Mark always wanted me to feel. In the quiet of my room, with the house buzzing faintly around me, I felt a shift inside. The same shift I had sensed downstairs, but stronger now, sharper. I knew the night was not finished with me. I knew I would have to walk back into that dining room soon. But for the moment, I sat still, letting the truth of my past settle into place like pieces of a puzzle I had been trying to assemble for years. I had no idea what Lydia and Mark were saying about me downstairs. I did not care. All I knew was that the next time I faced them, I would not be the girl who let them decide who I was. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long moment, letting the stillness wrap around me like a blanket. But the quiet never lasted in this house. It never had. A muffled thud came from downstairs, followed by Lydia's quick, sharp voice trying to steady the situation, and Mark's deeper tone layered with irritation. I could picture them perfectly, moving among the guests as if nothing had happened, pretending the slap had been nothing more than a moment of parental discipline. They were probably telling people I was dramatic, sensitive, difficult, anything to make themselves look stable. I stood and moved to the small mirror on my dresser. My cheek was still pink from where Mark had hit me, but the color had started to fade. The sting had not. I watched myself breathe, slow and steady, and whispered inside that I would not let this moment break me, not after everything I had already survived. My room had always been small, tucked into the back corner of the house, but it was one of the few places Lydia had not dared to redesign. She never cared enough to come in here unless she needed to criticize something. The lamp Evelyn bought me still sat on my nightstand, the one shaped like a flower that lit up in warm yellow. I turned it on, and the glow softened the edges of everything, even the knot in my stomach. I changed out of the blouse I had worn downstairs and pulled on an old sweatshirt from a thrift store. The kind of thing Lydia hated because it made me look like someone who did not care about presentation. I wrapped Evelyn's scarf gently and placed it on my desk chair so I would not forget it. Then I sat again, thinking back over the years, piecing together every moment that had led here. When I turned 16, I had taken a job at Morning Brew Tacoma, the little cafe 2 streets from the bus stop. At first I had applied because I wanted to help Mark with bills, thinking maybe it would mean something to him. He only said I should have done it sooner. After that, I stopped trying to win approval he never planned to give. Those early months at the cafe were exhausting. I balanced school, long shifts, and chores Lydia kept piling onto me. She called it responsibility, I called it punishment. I would come home smelling like espresso and cleaning products, only to find Mark sitting in the living room with legal briefs spread across the coffee table, not even glancing up when I walked in. Lydia acted like she did not notice me slipping through the door. Sometimes, if she was in the middle of a phone call, she would wave her hand in a dismissive motion, like I was interrupting something important just by breathing. The only place I felt remotely human was at the cafe. The lights were warm, the air smelled like cinnamon and roasted beans, nothing like the cold luxury Lydia forced into our house. Ben Carter was the shift manager. He was only 28, but he had that calm, steady presence that made you feel as if the world could fall, and he would still be standing there pouring coffee like nothing could shake him. He noticed how hard I worked but never commented on it in a way that felt intrusive. He just helped where he could, offering to take the last half hour of my shift if I looked too tired, swapping schedules when I needed time for school assignments. One evening, I was wiping down the pastry case when I heard Ben talking quietly with another barista near the counter. His voice carried just enough that a few words drifted over. Something about seeing Mark at the cafe the day before, talking to a man in a suit about removing a dependent from financial responsibility. I froze with the cloth in my hand. When Ben walked by, I asked who he saw Mark talking to, trying to sound casual. He said he did not know the man, only that the conversation looked tense. That night, a knot formed in my chest that would not loosen. Back home, Lydia's comments got sharper. She questioned when I came in. She questioned how many hours I worked. She even suggested that I needed to pay rent if I wanted to keep living there, which made no sense because I bought my own food and did more chores than anyone. I kept my mouth shut, but I felt something shifting in their tone, something cold, something like preparation. One afternoon, I came home early because school had released students early for a teacher in service day. As I stepped through the back gate, I heard Lydia's voice drifting over the fence, loud enough that I knew she wanted it to be heard. She was talking to a neighbor about how hard it was to raise a young woman who constantly crossed boundaries. She said she and Mark were considering legal options to protect themselves. She made it sound like I was some kind of danger. I stepped back before she saw me, my heart in my throat. I went around the house and entered through the front door instead. Grace Miller, who lived next door, saw me walking up the pathway and frowned gently. She asked if everything was all right. I shrugged and said I was fine. But Grace had known Evelyn. She had known me since I was small. She tilted her head in that way people do when they know you are lying but do not want to push you. She told me to stay strong and let her know if I ever needed anything. Those small words stayed with me for days. Inside the house, tensions grew. Lydia snapped more often. Mark grew colder. Some nights, I heard them whispering in their room after midnight, their voices low and angry. I pressed my ear to my bedroom door once and heard Lydia saying something about being tired of me hanging on and that it was time for Mark to act. His reply was muffled, but I caught phrases like legal advice and dependent status and timeline. My stomach twisted. I knew they were planning something. I just did not know what form it would take. I kept working at Morning Brew, pretending I did not hear anything, pretending I was not sinking deeper into uncertainty. One night after closing, Ben found me staring blankly at the espresso grinder. He asked gently if I was okay. I nodded, but he shook his head and placed a fresh cup of chamomile tea in front of me. He said the kind of line older women say they wish men said more often. He told me that whatever I was carrying, I did not have to hold all of it by myself. I did not tell him anything. I kept everything locked inside because exposing it felt dangerous. But that cup of tea stayed with me. The warmth of it, the way it softened the edges of a day that had been too sharp to stand. I walked home that night along the quiet streets under the flicker of street lamps and knew something was coming. Something bigger than Lydia's usual cruelty. Something that involved paperwork and signatures and the tightening grip of a man who needed control more than he needed a daughter. Now, sitting in my room after the slap, I could see how every moment had been building to this. Lydia's insults, Mark's disregard, the legal conversations whispered behind closed doors. They were preparing to cut me out long before tonight. The murmur of voices downstairs grew louder again, as if someone was demanding an explanation for what had happened. I stood at my window and looked at the driveway. Cars were still lined up along the curb. The night would go on without me for a little while longer. I closed the curtains and stepped away. I needed to gather my thoughts before returning to that dining room. I needed to understand what came next. My cheek still tingled with the imprint of Mark's hand, but inside me something steadier had formed, something shaped by years of being pushed aside, and by the quiet strength Evelyn had planted in me. I sat at my desk and traced the stitching on the scarf she had left behind. The soft fabric calmed my breath. I knew now that everything was shifting. I knew I could not stay invisible any longer, and I knew that whatever Lydia and Mark had planned, they had miscalculated one thing. I was not the quiet girl they thought they could erase. I kept telling myself I was not the quiet girl they thought they could erase, but knowing it and proving it were two different things. As I sat there in my room, tracing my fingers over the edge of Evelyn's scarf, something inside me tightened, a sense of direction, maybe, or the first spark of the courage I had been missing for years. I stood and slipped the scarf into my desk drawer, taking a steady breath before opening my bedroom door. The hallway lights cast long shadows across the floor as I walked toward the stairs. I could hear the low murmur of voices downstairs, a mixture of discomfort and forced politeness, the kind that always filled the house whenever Mark's image slipped for a moment and he had to scramble to put it back together. I stopped at the top of the stairs, listening to Lydia's voice carrying from the dining room. She was telling someone that tensions with me had been building for a long time. Her tone was soft and apologetic, the kind she used when she wanted people to feel sorry for her. I turned away before I heard more. I did not want their version of me to be the last thing in my head before facing the truth about what had been happening in this house. I walked instead to the back staircase that led down to the kitchen. It was quieter there. I stepped down slowly, grounding myself with each step. When I reached the bottom, the kitchen was empty, the only sound the soft humming of the refrigerator and the faint chatter drifting from the dining room. I pulled out a glass of water, but before I could take a sip, the back door creaked open and Holly stepped inside. Her face was flushed from the winter air, and her hair was pulled up in a messy bun like she had rushed over. She froze when she saw me and looked immediately worried. "Ava, I came as soon as I saw the texts. Are you okay?" The question was simple, but I could not answer right away. I finally managed a slow nod. "I am fine, or at least something close to it. How did you know to come? One of the girls from school is here tonight. She saw what happened. She called me because she was worried you would leave without anyone to help you." I set the glass down before it slipped from my hand. I had not even realized word had already spread beyond these walls. Holly walked over and stood beside me, not touching me, just offering her presence. I felt my shoulders drop slightly, the first release of tension since the slap. She glanced at my cheek. "It looks bad. He really did that in front of everyone." "Yes," I said quietly, "he did." She let out a long breath, pressing her lips together like she was holding back a flood of words. Then she asked the question she always asked when she sensed something deeper. "Tell me what is really going on." I leaned against the counter and gathered myself. All the pieces swirling in my head were heavy, but they needed to be spoken. I told her about the comments Lydia had thrown at me for months, the way Mark had grown colder, the whispers behind closed doors. the conversation Ben overheard at the cafe, and then I told her about the trust fund, about Evelyn's letter, and how it all suddenly made sense. Holly stared at me like she was watching a puzzle assemble itself in real time. So they want you out before you turn 21. That is why they are doing all this. I nodded. I think they believe if they can force me out, they can find a way to take what Evelyn left me. Holly blinked slowly, anger rising behind her eyes. You know what that means, right? They are planning something bigger than insults, something legal, something they can justify. I let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in me for months. I know. That is why I am done being afraid. There was a long pause. Then Holly leaned closer and lowered her voice. Ava, I need to tell you something. And it is going to sound wild, but you need to hear it. My stomach tightened. What? I have been watching Lydia for a while now. Ever since last fall when she kept showing up places without Mark and making strange calls. And a few days ago, I saw her get into a black Mercedes at the shopping center. The guy who picked her up was not Mark. I think it was Simon. I felt my throat close. The room blurred slightly at the edges. Simon, Mark's older brother, the one who visited often under the guise of checking on family. The man whose gentle smile had always seemed too polished around Lydia. I had brushed it off at first, but Holly's words pulled everything into sharp focus. Are you sure it was him? Yes, Holly said firmly. I got a picture. It is blurry, but you can see his profile. My breath faltered. If what she was saying was true, then the cracks in Lydia's perfect marriage were not cracks at all. They were fractures that had been spreading under the surface for years. Holly continued, and there is more. Grace told me she once heard Lydia and Simon arguing near the garage. She said it sounded personal, not family business. I pressed a hand to my chest. Fear and clarity collided so abruptly it made me dizzy. I wanted to deny it, to tell Holly she was wrong, but the truth had been whispering at me for months, and I had ignored it. Now it stood in front of me with its hands on my shoulders. I whispered, if that is real, then Colton might not be Mark's. Holly nodded slowly. That is exactly what I was thinking. The room felt small all of a sudden, like the walls had moved in, like the air had thickened. I gripped the counter and tried to steady myself. If Colton was not Mark's child, then everything Lydia and Mark had done to push me out took on a darker, more desperate shape. Holly stepped closer, her voice gentle. If you want answers, you know what to do. I looked up at her, searching her face. Holly, we cannot just accuse them. We cannot go to Mark with this. He will never believe me, and he will twist it against us. I know, that is why we do not accuse. We prove it. My breath caught. Holly's determination had always been her greatest strength, and tonight it lit something in me I had thought was long gone. She said calmly, DNA does not lie. I swallowed hard. The idea felt bold and terrifying and necessary all at once. A truth so sharp it could cut through years of manipulation in one clean strike. I whispered, how do we even start? Holly leaned in and spoke quietly but firmly. We start with what we can get. A hair from Mark, a hair from Simon, a sample from Colton. Then we find a lab in Seattle. They will process it. No questions asked. I felt the ground shift beneath me. The plan was simple in words but monumental in reality. It felt like stepping into a storm with no shelter, but also like finally choosing not to drown. Holly looked at my face and added, you do not have to do it alone. I am with you. Something in my chest cracked open. Relief, fear, gratitude, a mixture of all three. I nodded, feeling tears gather but refusing to let them fall. I said softly, if we do this, everything will change. Holly answered, it already has. Footsteps echoed from the dining room, moving toward the kitchen. We both froze, listening as voices drifted closer. Holly squeezed my arm, then slipped quietly back toward the back door, disappearing into the cold air outside. I stood alone in the kitchen, the weight of a new truth pressing firmly into my hands. The house buzzed faintly with distant conversation, but my mind had already stepped far beyond these walls. If Lydia and Simon were hiding something, I was going to find it. And if the truth was as deep as I feared, then tonight was only the beginning. I picked up the glass of water again, my hands steady now, and took a long, slow sip. The cold slid down my throat like a promise. Then I turned and walked toward the doorway that led back into the heart of the house. I stepped through the kitchen doorway and moved quietly down the hall, the murmur of voices fading behind me. as if the whole house exhaled at once. I felt strangely detached, as though I were walking inside a memory, instead of a moment still unfolding. The light over the staircase flickered once when I passed beneath it, and a chill moved across my shoulders. I ignored it and kept going until I reached the small hallway that led to Mark's office. The door was closed. It usually was. Mark guarded that room like a vault, but I knew he often left strands of hair on the leather headrest of his chair. Stress made him run his hands through his hair, tugging it back, smoothing it forward, leaving little traces behind. I stood there for a moment, listening. The noise downstairs stayed constant. No footsteps on the stairs. No sudden movements in the hall. I pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. The office smelled like cologne and old paper, a sharp, masculine scent that made my stomach tighten. The lamp on the desk was still on, casting a ring of warm light across his files. I approached the chair and ran my fingers lightly across the top. Nothing. I leaned down and checked the cushion. My heart thudded when I saw a few short, dark strands caught along the seam. I plucked them carefully and tucked them into a small, resealable bag I had taken from my art supplies earlier in the week. My hands shook, but not from fear, from purpose. My next task was harder. I needed a sample from Colton, and that required entering Lydia's space. I slipped out of the office and moved down the hallway toward the nursery. The door was ajar, and the faint hum of a white noise machine drifted out. I paused, listening for Lydia's voice. Nothing, just the soft rhythmic breathing of a sleeping child. The nursery was dimly lit by a tiny nightlight shaped like a bear. I stood there for a moment, absorbing the innocence of the room. Pale blue walls, stuffed animals lined neatly on a shelf, a mobile turning slowly in the corner. The baby in the crib slept soundly, his small chest rising and falling. For a moment, my anger faded and something tender pulled at me. None of this was his fault. He was just a child born into a mess created by adults who could not tell the truth. I noticed a spit cloth draped over the side of the crib, still damp from when Lydia had carried him earlier. I used a clean tissue to dab at the wet patch, gathering a bit of saliva, then sealed it into a second bag. I whispered an apology he would never hear, toward a child who had no idea how many lives were about to split open because of the truth tied to him. As I stepped into the hall, the light from the nursery spilled across my feet. I turned and shut the door gently, careful not to make a sound. Only one sample remained, Simon. I walked back towards the stairs, feeling the weight of each bag tucked safely in my pocket. The hum of conversation reached me again as I descended the steps. I lingered at the bottom, glancing toward the dining room. Through the open doorway, I saw Mark speaking with two guests. Lydia fussed with a wine glass, pretending to be fragile and overwhelmed. Simon stood at the far end of the table with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on a point no one could see. He looked agitated, tense, and oddly pale. If guilt had a posture, it looked like him in that moment. I needed a distraction, something quick, something to pull eyes away for just long enough. I stepped to the side and let my foot hit the decorative metal vase near the console table. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. Several guests turned at once. Lydia gasped dramatically. Mark swore under his breath, and even Simon flinched. Perfect. While eyes focused on me, Holly slipped through the side door. She moved with that quick confidence she had always carried, her steps silent as she intercepted Simon near the coat closet. She bumped into him lightly, pretending to trip on the rug. Simon reached out on instinct, steadying her by the elbow. When he withdrew his hand, Holly had already collected two tiny hairs from the shoulder of his coat. She gave the smallest nod toward me before stepping away into the hall. No one noticed, not even Simon, who was too busy smoothing his sleeve and glancing toward the dining room, as if checking whether Lydia had seen him talking to another woman. I walked past him calmly, heart drumming but steps steady. He did not look at me. Neither did Mark. I might as well have been invisible, which for once worked in my favor. I stepped into the hallway and found Holly already waiting by the half-bath near the stairs. She handed me the third bag with a whisper of relief. I closed my fingers around it tightly. 3 samples, 1 truth. I felt something in my chest shift, a sense of momentum taking hold. We left the hallway slowly, walking toward the back of the house. No one stopped us. Everyone was too busy tending to the fragile edges of Mark and Lydia's reputation. Once outside, cold air hit my face like a cleansing rush. Holly wrapped her arms around herself as we walked down the side path toward the driveway. She spoke softly as we reached the car. "The hard part is over. Now we just need a lab." I nodded, pulling the scarf tighter around my neck. I had already researched labs late at night when I suspected something was wrong. There was a facility in Seattle that processed anonymous samples without asking questions. It would cost money, but I had saved enough from the cafe. Every paycheck I had tucked away in a tin box under my bed finally had a purpose. We got into Holly's old sedan. She started the engine, and the heater sputtered to life with a tired cough. As she pulled out of the driveway, I looked back at the house one last time. The large windows glowed warm against the winter dark, but I felt no warmth from them. Only the shape of years spent trying to belong to a place that had never been mine. The streets of North Tacoma wound past us in a blur. Holiday lights still hung from porch railings, and the air smelled faintly of cedar from nearby yards. The quiet inside the car made my heart beat louder in my chest. Holly rested one hand on the steering wheel and asked gently if I was sure. I stared out the window at the passing houses. If I did not do this now, I said, I would never be free of them. We reached the highway, and Seattle's distant lights shimmered ahead like a promise. I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes, feeling the samples in my pocket. Mark, Simon, Colton, 3 threads tied together in a knot that had nearly strangled me for years. I was finally in a position to pull it loose. Holly kept driving north, her face set with determination. The road stretched ahead, quiet and long, the kind of road that feels like it is carrying you toward the truth, whether you are ready for it or not. I watched the city lights grow brighter as we approached, reflecting faintly on the edges of the windshield. My pulse quickened, my hands warmed despite the cold. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. The lights of Seattle deepened in color as we merged into the quieter streets north of downtown, and the hum of the heater filled the silence between us. Holly parked near a row of small office buildings, their windows glowing against the night like little islands of truth waiting to be reached. I stared at the sign above the entrance of the lab, a plain printed panel with letters that meant everything to me in that moment. Seattle DNA Diagnostics. We walked together across the cold pavement. The wind bit at my cheeks, still tender from the slap hours earlier, but I kept moving. The lobby was small and softly lit, with a row of chairs and a counter behind glass. A woman with tired eyes looked up as we entered. She asked if she could help us, and I told her I needed to submit a set of samples for paternity testing. She handed me a form, her voice patient but neutral, the voice of someone who had probably heard confessions far heavier than ours. I filled out the paperwork without answering the sections asking for identities. Anonymous testing, additional fee. I initialed the box and slid everything back under the window, along with the 3 small bags that now held the most fragile truth I had ever carried. The woman took them and said results typically came within 10 days. I thanked her with a voice that barely reached the glass. When we stepped back outside, the air felt colder than before, as if the city itself had paused to listen. Holly pulled her coat tighter and looked at me with a small spark of relief. "It is done now," she said quietly. "The hardest part is behind us." "Maybe," I said, "or maybe the hardest part is the waiting." We drove home under the slow glow of passing highway lights. The roads were nearly empty, and the silence in the car felt heavier now, as if we had stepped across a line that could not be crossed back. I kept seeing the 3 bags being carried into the back room of the lab and wondered how something so small could hold something so life-changing. By the time Holly dropped me near the corner of my street, the house was mostly dark. A few windows still glowed, but the party had ended, and the guests were gone. The driveway was empty except for Mark's car. Holly pressed her hand on mine and asked if I would be all right. I nodded because I had to be. I stepped out of her car and watched her drive away, her headlights shrinking until they disappeared. I walked slowly toward the house, the gravel crunching under my shoes. The porch light flickered overhead as if unsure whether it wanted to guide me in or warn me away. I pushed the front door open and stepped inside quietly. The living room was dim, lit only by a single floor lamp. Mark sat on the couch with a drink in his hand, still in the shirt he had worn to the dinner. Lydia paced near the fireplace with her arms crossed. Both of them looked up when I entered. I felt the tension in the air thicken around me. Mark said in a hard voice that I had embarrassed him. I told him I had simply removed myself to calm down. Lydia muttered something about me being dramatic. But I ignored her. She was restless, like she expected something to fall apart but could not figure out which piece would go first. I went upstairs without another word. I could feel their eyes on my back, could feel the space between us widening. In my room, I shut the door and leaned against it, counting my breaths until the thudding in my chest eased. I sat on the bed and told myself I just needed to survive the next 10 days. Just 10 days. But I was wrong about that timeline. 2 mornings later, I woke to the sound of raised voices downstairs. I sat up fast, adrenaline flooding me before my feet even touched the floor. I stepped into the hallway and listened. Mark and Lydia were arguing in the kitchen. Lydia's voice was sharp and angry. Mark's was lower, edged with something like strain. I moved closer, staying out of sight. Lydia told him she was tired of dealing with me and wanted things to be finalized soon. She said people were talking after the incident at the dinner. She asked how long he planned to let a grown girl guilt-trip him into taking care of her. Mark told her to lower her voice, that he was considering options and needed time. Then she said she would not stand by and let me stay in this house forever. A soft click on tile told me she had set down her mug hard. Mark answered in the tone he used when he was cornered. He said he had spoken to someone at a firm about what could be done in situations involving adopted dependents who refused to contribute. Lydia said that was not enough. She wanted me gone. My stomach twisted. Everything Holly and I suspected was true. They were preparing to cut me out with paperwork that would look clean and justified to anyone who did not know what they were really after. I stepped back from the hallway and returned to my room before either of them saw me. My pulse thudded at the base of my throat. I sat on my bed and tried to steady my breath. I kept telling myself that I had already taken the biggest step by submitting the DNA samples. Now I just needed to wait for the results to come. But waiting with this knowledge felt like holding a match while staring at a line of gasoline on the floor. The next week passed slowly and carefully. Mark grew quieter, disappearing into his office or leaving early for work. Lydia grew more irritable, snapping at me for small things. I avoided them both as much as possible and stayed out of the house when I could. Holly checked in constantly, offering to let me stay at her place. But I refused. Not yet. On a Thursday morning, I was sitting in my room, folding laundry, when my phone buzzed. A new email notification appeared on the screen. My stomach tightened when I saw the lab's name in the subject line. I froze. The air in my room felt suddenly too small. I stared at the message for a long moment without opening it. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear blood rushing in my ears. My hands trembled as I finally tapped the screen. The email opened. I read the first line, then the second, then the final result. My vision blurred for a moment as the truth sank in. I closed my eyes and let the weight of it settle into me, deep and undeniable. I set the phone down on my bed and pressed both hands against my mouth to keep from making any sound. It was real, not a suspicion, not a possibility, not a fear. A fact that would change everything inside that house. I sat there in the soft morning light, shaking, knowing that nothing could go back to the way it had been. And for the first time in my life, I did not feel afraid of that truth. I stayed seated on the edge of my bed for a long time, holding the truth in my hands like it was something alive and trembling. The room felt still, the kind of stillness that comes right before a storm hits the coastline. My chest rose and fell slowly as I read the result again, each word burning into me. I set the phone aside and wiped my palms on my jeans, trying to steady myself. I knew this moment would come, but I had not expected it to feel this heavy or this clarifying. Voices drifted up the stairs, Lydia speaking in that tight, sharp tone she used when something did not go her way. Mark answering with clipped annoyance. I stood, smoothing the crease in my shirt, and looked at myself in the mirror. My face was pale, but my eyes felt steadier than they had in years. I whispered to my reflection, almost as if Evelyn could hear me through the glass. It is time. When the evening of the dinner came, the house was clean in a way that made it feel staged, not lived in. Lydia had set the table with polished silver and layered linen napkins. The chandelier glowed softly above the long table, illuminating the crystal glasses she insisted on using only when important people came over. For once, the guests were not people I recognized. They were colleagues from Mark's firm, neighbors who barely knew my name, and a couple from Lydia's design business. I moved quietly around the perimeter of the room, helping set out bread plates and lighting candles while Lydia supervised with a firm gaze. Every time she looked at me, her eyes held a strange mix of suspicion and triumph. She thought she had already won whatever silent war she was waging. Mark walked past me once, brushing close as he adjusted his tie. He did not acknowledge me. He had barely spoken to me all week. As people began to arrive, laughter filled the foyer, coats rustled, compliments floated through the air, and the scent of roasted chicken drifted from the kitchen. I tucked the envelope into the inner pocket of my sweater, close to my heartbeat. Holly had offered to come tonight in case I needed someone nearby, but I told her I could do this alone. She reminded me that doing something alone did not mean being alone. I held on to that. By 7, everyone had taken their seats. The dining room buzzed with small conversations. Lydia walked behind each guest, offering smiles and pouring wine. She looked beautiful, she always did. She dressed herself like a woman who wanted the world to admire her, and most people did. I stood near the far end of the table, next to an empty chair that Lydia had not bothered to assign to anyone. I had not been given a place card. It did not surprise me. She once told me that hosting meant precise arrangement, and she did not want to rearrange anything to add me in. When the plates were set and glasses filled, Mark stood at the head of the table and cleared his throat. The room quieted instantly. Even the faint clink of silver stopped. He placed both hands on the back of Lydia's chair, leaning slightly forward as if assuming his familiar commanding position. I would like to say a few words. He began with that polished voice he used at firm events. Thank you all for joining us tonight. This family has had its challenges recently, and we feel it is time to address something important and bring clarity. The word clarity pulled the air straight from my lungs. I saw the direction he was going. Lydia's eyes met his briefly, and a flicker of satisfaction passed between them. She straightened in her chair, placing her hand gently over his. Mark continued, families change. People grow apart. Sometimes, difficult decisions have to be made for the good of everyone involved. I felt the envelope press against my ribs. My fingers curled along the side of my sweater, steadying myself. Lydia glanced at me briefly, her smile small and tight, the kind you give when you are waiting for someone to fall. I took one slow breath. Mark lifted his glass. Ava has been with us for many years, but the time has come for her to find her own path forward. A murmur filled the room. A couple of guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing something was wrong but not knowing the full story. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to stay still. I knew what this moment would look like if I interrupted too soon. Mark lowered the glass, his face hard. She is not our biological daughter, and she has chosen to distance herself from the values of this home. Values! The word struck like a cold wave. Lydia leaned forward, lowering her eyes with a display of gentle sorrow. She said softly, as if confiding in the table, "It has been very difficult trying to help her." The lie sat heavily in the air. I stepped forward before Mark could continue. My voice came out steady. "If you want clarity," I said, "then let us give everyone here the whole truth." Mark turned sharply. "Sit down. This is not your moment." I kept my eyes on him, on the man who had raised me, fed me, clothed me, and treated me like a mistake he never stopped regretting. A man who wanted to erase me before I could claim what Evelyn left. "It is exactly my moment," I said quietly. The room fell still. Lydia stiffened. Mark's jaw tightened. I reached into my sweater and pulled out the envelope. It was heavier than paper should ever feel. I placed it on the table and kept my palm on it. "You want to talk about who belongs in this family. You want to talk about blood and responsibility and truth. So let us talk about the child you praise every day, the one you have been showing off to your colleagues and friends." Lydia blinked hard. A nervous shake touched her breath. Mark frowned, confused and irritated. I slid the envelope open and pulled out the printed result. My hand did not shake. I read it clearly, letting each word fall into the room like a stone into water. Colton Hale Turner's biological father is identified with a probability of 99.98% as Simon Turner. Silence, a complete absolute silence. Every guest stared at me, then at Mark, then at Simon, who had gone pale and rigid at the far end of the table. Lydia gripped the edge of her napkin, her knuckles whitening. Mark's eyes widened, confusion shifting into dawning horror. He turned toward Lydia, searching her face for denial, for reassurance, for a lie he could cling to. She stared back at him with a look I had never seen before. Fear, real fear. One woman covered her mouth. A man whispered something under his breath. A fork clattered to a plate. The sound was small but sharp enough to split the air. Simon stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. His eyes darted toward the door. A guest stepped in front of him, not aggressively, just startled. But it was enough to make him freeze. Mark finally spoke. It was not a shout, not even anger, just a single word broken open. Lydia. She looked at him. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The room watched her like she was a glass about to shatter. I continued, my voice low. You wanted clarity. This is clarity. The child you raise is not yours. The woman you defend is not who you think she is. You tried to erase me to protect your perfect image while she erased the truth behind your back. Someone in the room whispered that they had never seen anything like this. Someone else whispered that they suspected something was wrong for years. Mark leaned heavily on the back of Lydia's chair, his face drained of color. Lydia stood suddenly, pushing her chair back so hard it scraped across the floor. She bolted from the room with a sharp breath, nearly stumbling over her own heels as she headed toward the hallway. Simon tried to follow her, but was stopped by another guest who demanded answers. His face tightened, his composure cracking as he muttered that he needed to leave. Mark turned toward me, his eyes wide in a way that made him look smaller, betrayed, humiliated, lost. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Guests rose from their chairs, whispering urgently, gathering phones and coats. Some looked at me with sympathy. Others looked stunned. The entire room felt unsteady, as if someone had tilted the floor beneath us. I stepped back slowly. My pulse was steady, my hands warm. I did not look at Mark again. I had given him the truth he demanded, not the truth he expected, the truth he needed. As I walked out of the dining room, the noise behind me rose like a wave. Shock, anger, confusion, voices overlapping, a glass breaking somewhere near the table, someone calling Lydia's name, someone scolding Simon, someone asking if Mark was all right. I kept walking. Ahead of me, the hallway stretched quiet and dim, and for the first time in my life inside that house, I did not feel afraid of what waited on the other end. I walked down the dim hallway with the voices from the dining room fading behind me, each step loosening something tight in my chest. The house felt strangely hollow, as if the truth I had dropped into the center of that table had cracked the walls themselves. I reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, listening to the muffled chaos behind me. Someone was shouting my name, maybe Mark, maybe a guest trying to calm him. I did not turn back. I placed my hand on the railing and climbed slowly, feeling each step steady under my feet. When I reached the top, the landing was quiet. I walked into my room and closed the door gently, not slamming it, not hiding, just closing it like a chapter ending in a book I had outgrown. I leaned against the door and let out a long breath that shook at the end. My hands trembled for the first time since I read the result. The tension that had held me upright all evening suddenly released, leaving a heavy ache behind my ribs. I moved to my desk and sat down. The scarf Evelyn left me lay folded neatly where I had placed it earlier. I picked it up and let the fabric slip through my fingers. If she had been here tonight, she would not have raised her voice or tried to stop me. She would have stood behind me quietly, like a lighthouse shining over a dark shore. I breathed in slowly and let myself feel her steadiness. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, uneven, Mark's. I set the scarf aside and straightened in my chair. His footsteps stopped just outside my door. For a moment, I thought he might burst in. But he did not. Instead, he spoke with a cracked voice I had only heard once before, on the night Evelyn died. "Ava, open the door." I did not move. He tried again, slower this time. "We need to talk." I stared ahead at this blank wall across from me. Everything he had wanted to say to me over the years had already been spoken in his silence, in his absence, in that slap. And everything I needed to say had already been spoken downstairs. After a long moment, he exhaled sharply and walked away. The house stayed restless long into the night. I heard muffled voices, slamming doors, the scrape of furniture as someone moved something in a rush. At one point, A sharp knock echoed from the front door, followed by hushed arguing. I thought I recognized Simon's voice, frantic and strained, but I could not make out the words. By midnight, the noise faded into a quiet that did not feel peaceful. It felt like exhaustion. I lay on my bed fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed the moment the words left my mouth at the table, the way the room froze, and the way Lydia's face transformed into a mask of panic. I drifted somewhere between wakefulness and sleep until the first hint of dawn pushed through my window. The next morning, the house felt heavy, the kind of heaviness left behind after something breaks. I walked downstairs and found the dining room still in disarray. Wine glasses half full, napkins tossed aside, a chair knocked over. Lydia was gone. So was Simon. Mark sat alone at the table with his head in his hands. He did not lift his gaze when I walked through the room. I kept going. I stepped outside and breathed in the cold air. It felt cleaner than the air inside the house. My phone buzzed in my hoodie pocket. A message from Holly. She asked if I needed her. I typed that I was fine, but she said she would come anyway. 20 minutes later, her old sedan pulled up quietly along the curb. She rolled down the window and looked at me carefully. "Get in!" I climbed in, clutching Evelyn's scarf. Holly noticed the way I held it and softened her voice. "How bad is it in there?" "Bad enough," I said. "But it is over. The truth is out." She nodded. She did not ask questions. She just drove. We headed toward her apartment near Stadium District. When we arrived, her mom was already awake, setting out coffee and an extra blanket on the couch. She had the kind of warm presence that made you feel safe the moment you stepped inside. She did not pry either. She simply said, "You can stay as long as you want." The room smelled faintly of lavender and warm bread. It felt like shelter. Later that day, I called Eleanor Brooks, Evelyn's attorney. I told her everything, my voice steady even as my hands shook. She listened carefully and said she had suspected for a long time that something in that house was not right. She asked if I felt safe returning. I said no. She told me that was all she needed to hear. She reminded me that the trust fund was legally protected, that Mark could not touch a cent, and that nothing he said or did could remove my rights. Her assurance landed inside me like a stone, creating a calm center I had not felt in years. In the afternoon, Holly and I walked to a small bakery near her apartment. The sky was gray with low clouds, but the air smelled like rain and comfort. As we waited for our drinks, Holly told me the neighborhood had already started talking about the scene at the Turner house. She said one of the neighbors saw Lydia leave in a rideshare just before midnight carrying a half-packed bag. Someone else said they saw Simon's car speeding out of the neighborhood shortly after. I felt no satisfaction at the thought of their escape, only inevitability. Secrets do not stay buried forever, and theirs had been waiting to break loose for years. We walked back to Holly's place and settled on the couch. I wrapped the scarf around my shoulders and let myself rest. Outside, raindrops tapped softly on the window. Inside, the warmth from the heater made the room feel almost like the home I had always wanted. In the evening, Grace Miller knocked on the door. She asked to speak with me, and her eyes filled with worry when I stepped outside. I told her I was staying with Holly for now. She squeezed my hand gently with those steady, capable fingers that had held so many truths over the years. She said she had heard shouting from the Turner house late the night before and wanted to make sure I was safe. I thanked her, feeling a soft ache in my chest. As the day came to a close, I knew I had decisions to make. The house I had grown up in was no longer a home. It had stopped being one long before last night, but walking away felt heavier than I expected. It felt like letting go of every version of myself that had tried to fit into that place. I lay on the couch in Holly's living room with the lamp casting a soft glow across the carpet. The walls hummed with the quiet of a safe home. My eyes drifted closed. Tomorrow, everything would change again. Mark would call, maybe plead, maybe rage. Lydia and Simon would scatter like shadows avoiding the light, and I would take the next step toward building a life that was mine alone. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt the tender, steady pulse of freedom. I woke the next morning to the soft light filtering through the thin curtains in Holly's living room, and for the first few seconds I forgot everything that had happened. The quiet felt warm and unfamiliar, like a blanket someone had tucked around me while I slept. Then the memory of the night before rushed back and my chest tightened. Not with fear this time, but with a strange kind of clarity. The truth was out. Whatever came next would be built on that truth, not the lies I had been forced to live under. Holly's mom was already in the kitchen, moving gently, the way nurses do when they do not want to disturb a patient. She offered me breakfast and a soft smile and asked nothing else. I sat at the table with her for a few minutes, grateful for a silence that was not heavy or judgmental. It felt like belonging in a way I had forgotten was possible. Later that morning, Holly insisted we go for a walk. The sky was cloudy but bright, and the sidewalks glistened from the steady rain overnight. We walked toward the edge of Stadium District, where the streets dipped toward the Sound. The water was a sheet of gray glass in the distance. Holly nudged me gently with her elbow and said she was proud of me. I did not know what to say, so I thanked her and kept walking. Pride was not an emotion I had felt much growing up. When we returned to her apartment, my phone buzzed repeatedly with missed calls, all from Mark. I stared at the screen for a moment, then placed the phone face down on the table. I could not talk to him yet. Maybe not ever. 2 hours later, a text came instead. It said he wanted to explain himself and that the previous night had been a misunderstanding. I felt a hollow ache where his words used to matter. I turned the phone off. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly. Tacoma was not a large city, and the neighborhood around our old house was even smaller. Grace told me she heard people talking about the dinner at the grocery store and the post office. Someone said they saw Simon leaving town early that morning. Another said Lydia had been seen getting into a cab with a suitcase and that she had not returned. I believed both. On Wednesday, Eleanor Brooks called to schedule a meeting. I met her in her office, a quiet room filled with shelves of neatly labeled binders and soft green plants. She explained the trust fund in clear, calm language. It was mine alone. It could not be redirected toward Mark, nor could he access it without my consent. She warned me that he might still try to challenge things, but the documents Evelyn had created were ironclad. Hearing that lifted something heavy off my shoulders. It felt like Evelyn had reached through time to protect me. When I stepped out of Eleanor's office, I took a deep breath and felt something I had not felt in years. A future that was mine, not borrowed, not controlled. I moved out of the Turner house officially the next day. Holly and her mom helped me pack my things for my room. Most of my belongings fit into 2 boxes. Lydia's touch had stripped so many pieces of my life from that house that there was not much left to take. Mark stayed in his office with the door closed the entire time. I could hear him moving around in there, pacing maybe, but he did not come out. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He did not look for me. As I loaded the boxes into Holly's car, I looked up at the windows of the house I had lived in since childhood. The curtains were drawn, the house felt drained, as if every secret had been pulled out into the open and the structure itself had sagged under the weight of it. I wondered if Mark understood yet how everything had fallen apart. I wondered if he blamed me or himself or Lydia or Simon. Then I realized it no longer mattered. Life began to shift quickly after that. Holly's family let me stay in their spare room until I found a place of my own. I kept working at Morning Brew Tacoma and signed my lease on a small studio apartment near UW Tacoma that had just enough space for a bed, a desk, and a tiny living area. It felt perfect. I painted the walls myself and set Evelyn's scarf on the back of my desk chair, letting it drape like a quiet reminder that I had survived something that once felt impossible. Mark tried to reach out twice more, once by phone, once through a letter he left at the cafe, asking me to come home and insisting we could discuss things. I read the letter once and then placed it in the bottom of a drawer. I never responded. Maybe one day I would find the softness to forgive him. But forgiveness is not a door you can force open, and I was not ready. A few weeks later, I started my first quarter at UW Tacoma. On the morning of the first day of classes, I stood outside the lecture hall clutching my backpack. Students streamed past me in clusters, talking animatedly about their schedules. My stomach fluttered with nerves, but there was excitement too, something bright and new pulsing beneath the surface of everything. I walked into my literature class and found a seat near the window. I watched the campus stir to life outside and felt a slow bloom of gratitude. I had fought to be here. I had clawed my way out of a place that tried to make me small, and now I could breathe. In the evenings after class, I often walked down to the waterfront. The air smelled of salt and pine, and the lights along the pier shimmered across the water. Sometimes Holly joined me with cups of hot chocolate, and we would sit on a bench talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes I walked alone, letting the stillness settle into my bones. Tacoma had always been a place of loss for me, but now it was becoming a place of becoming. I saw in the newspaper a month later that Mark's firm had placed him on indefinite leave. The scandal had reached clients, and his reputation had taken a hit he could not cover. I heard through Grace that he was fighting for shared custody of Colton, but the court had required confirmation of paternity. It did not go well. Simon had disappeared from the area entirely. Lydia was somewhere in Portland, according to rumor. None of it surprised me. As spring approached, my days at the university filled with studying, coffee shifts, and long quiet moments where I let myself remember Evelyn not with grief, but with gratitude. I found myself walking past the education building just to see the young teachers in training gather at the entrance with their books and lesson plans. It reminded me of her, and for once the memory made me smile. One evening, I sat at my little desk with the scarf draped around my shoulders and wrote about the dinner, the truth, and everything that followed. Not because I needed to relive it, but because I wanted to understand the strength that carried me through. When I finished, I folded the paper and placed it beside the scarf. It felt like closing a chapter gently, not harshly. The life I was building was small and simple, but it was mine. The choices were mine. The freedom was mine. And as I sit here now, sharing the story, I hope it reaches someone who needs to hear it. Families are not always defined by blood. Sometimes they are built through kindness and resilience, and the courage to stand up when you have been pushed down for far too long. If you have ever felt erased, overlooked, or pushed aside, know that truth has a way of finding its light. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of a moment when you found your own strength, I would love to hear it. Share your thoughts or your experiences in the comments. Your stories matter. They help others feel less alone. And if you want to stay for more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and keep walking with me.